Flop. It's a powerful word, isn't it? Just the structure of the word is designed to elicit a visceral response from anyone who hears it. But what is a flop, truly? The word gets thrown around frequently, and yet it feels like none of us really know what it means.
Performers were seriously injured. Reviews were dreadful.
The worst idea yet for musicals.
They worried about the gross and crass commercialism. Well, on Broadway, the commercialism is gone. It's just gross and crass.
You could take the money and throw it.
The quick-gutted reaction is to think a flop show equals a bad show. This horrible catastrophe that closed in 3 days, lost hundreds of millions of dollars, killed at least 7 cast members, and led to an angry mob burning down the theater. Does that happen? Of course. But it's far from the norm. It might be hard to believe, but the chances are higher that your favorite Broadway musical, or at least a musical that you've heard of, actually qualifies as a commercial flop. Nobody or no show is immune to something not working. Given how abstract a subject like this is, how does one even start to break it down? And more importantly, do we even need to? This video is about more than just finding a proper way to define what makes a Broadway flop. It's about challenging the notion that flop equals bad.
Keep talking.
What was I saying?
You were saying that under the right circumstances, a producer could make more money with a flop than he could with a hit.
Yes, it's quite possible.
You keep saying that, but you don't tell me how.
The first step to defining a Broadway flop is knowing how to spot one. In his revered 1991 book, Not Since Carrie, critic Ken Mendelbaum defines a flop as ran less than 250 performances, received no national tour, and hasn't been performed with regularity since. The go-to example for how to classify a flop for over 30 years. But the industry and the world as a whole have changed a lot since the 90s, and under some scrutiny, this criteria doesn't really hold up anymore. Limited runs are much more popular, meaning it's not fair to classify a show as a flop just because it ran for 190 performances. Likewise, shows that received critical praise and went on to conquer the world internationally sometimes skipped the national tour segment altogether. Meanwhile, some critical and financial Broadway misfires continue to be performed by community and regional theaters to this day. If I've learned anything from the past 3 years of doing this, it's that everyone's got a different interpretation of what makes a flop a flop. Did it get bad reviews? Did it not make its money back? Was Bono involved? These questions provide a great starting point, but they don't offer that one-size-fits-all solution. Nowadays, there's way too many moving parts to base whether a show flopped or not on just one criteria. You need 4. Criteria number 1. Did the musical recoup its initial investment while on Broadway? Underneath all the glitz, glamour, and lights, it's important to remember that Broadway is a business, and a complicated one at that. The industry is pretty much the same thing as making a blockbuster movie while also running a rainforest cafe. Yes, creators need to make something entertaining that will sell a lot of tickets, but they also have to juggle paying employees, utilities, and a bunch of other recurring weekly expenses in a way the film industry just doesn't. Once a movie is made and screened, that's it. Production costs are done. Theater, on the other hand, is alive. It's this movie that gets remade over and over night after night. Even if a show does gangbusters and rakes in $1 million a week, if it costs $1.5 million a week to stage, it's actually losing money. That's a huge reason roughly 80% of Broadway shows close without recouping their investment. Considering how large that percentage is, if recoupment was the only metric, Nearly every Broadway musical classifies as a flop. And that brings us to criteria number 2. Did the musical receive a positive review in the New York Times? A lot of publications write reviews on Broadway shows, but none of them wield as mighty a sword as the Times. The publication's power is infamous for crushing even the most promising of shows with the simple click of the publish button. Now, it's easy to say, who cares about reviews? But the answer is, a lot of people who are looking for any reason not to drop $100+ on a Broadway ticket. People need convincing. And that goes hand in hand with the next criteria. Criteria number 3. Did the musical win any main program Tony Awards? A lot of people like to hate on the Tony Awards as this night where one city gives itself a proverbial pat on the back, and that the awards don't really mean anything. But, much like the New York Times review, they play a huge role in the life or death of a show. Getting a Tony Award in acting, writing, direction, musical composition, or best musical itself, those are extremely effective marketing tools. Case in point, Fun Home. Even though it received rave reviews, the musical's early Broadway run received a lukewarm response, and come the Tony Awards, closure felt imminent. All of that changed after Fun Home won 5 Tony Awards, including Best Musical. Ticket sales skyrocketed, and it ran for another year and a half. So that brings us to the final criteria. Criteria number 4. Did the show run on Broadway for more than a year? Or, if it's a limited engagement, did it fulfill the full length of its run? A great way to gauge overall public interest: if a musical can't consistently draw enough crowds to survive through the off months in between the summer break and the holiday rush, then something probably isn't working. Not every musical is a smash hit, just like everyone isn't a commercial flop. To determine the level of a show's success on Broadway, we can use a method I created called the flop test. If a musical matches 3 to 4 of the criteria, it's in hit territory. The land where shows prove profitable to investors, rake in the awards, critical praise, and run on Broadway for years. These are your Hamiltons, your Rents, your Hadestowns. 2 matches? These are the tweeners. The shows that don't quite count as Broadway smashes, but they don't count as flops either. They're stuck in between. These are your SpongeBobs, your Shreks, your Strange Loops. And if it matches 0 to 1, it's in flop territory. This is where, for one reason or another, something just didn't work, and the piece wasn't a successful commercial venture in New York. These are your Dianas, your Seussicles, your Great Comets. There's always been this deep-rooted battle between art and commerce. A piece of art may be absolutely incredible, but for some reason it either doesn't work commercially, or someone makes bad business moves and it gets sacrificed to the flop gods. Enter Natasha, Pierre, and the Great Comet of 1812. The show, a musical adaptation of a 94-page section of the book War and Peace, received rave reviews for its 2 off-Broadway runs. Composer Dave Malloy's energetic score and director Rachel Chafkin's innovative staging made the musical an experience unlike anything else in the theater world. When it moved to Broadway, with Josh Groban as Pierre in October of 2016, everything pointed towards the show becoming a bona fide hit. The way the musical spoke to younger and more diverse audiences left many mentioning it in the same breath as Hamilton. The New York Times gave it a rave review, and it received an astonishing 12 Tony Award nominations. And that's when the tide started to turn. Even though Great Comet led the way with the most nominations of the season, the show shockingly walked away from Tony Award night with no main program awards, getting shut out by Broadway darling Dear Evan Hansen. Comet's ticket sales began to slide. a downward trajectory that only accelerated once former Hamilton star Oak Onauduan took over for Groban in July 2017. Producers realized the only way Comet could survive was through celebrity stunt casting. Just 1 month after he joined the production, producers announced Onauduan's replacement. The team neglected to take into account the racial optics of the move, replacing Onauduan, a black actor, with stage and screen star Mandy Patinkin. The social media uproar was immense, and even led to Patinkin pulling out of the show. By September, the musical, once poised to light Broadway on fire, went down in a cloud of dust and ashes, just 10 months after it opened. The magic of the presentation, power of the story, and beauty of the music make it hard to believe that technically, Great Comet flopped on Broadway.
It received a great review from the New York Times, but it failed to win any major Tony Awards, ran less than a year, and failed to recoup its $14 million investment.
Artistically, Great Comet is one of the greatest and most revolutionary pieces of musical theater to ever hit Broadway. Commercially, it's a flop. This raises the question: should flops be used as measuring sticks for artistry?
The keys to Broadway have belonged to a dynamic duo that's produced and written hit after hit show. So there's been a lot of curiosity over the pair's latest endeavor.
Barely 2 weeks. That's how long the musical Merrily We Roll Along ran at the Alvin Theater. Based on the 1934 play by the same name, Merrily We Roll Along tells the story of 3 successful artists in reverse, going backwards from 1980 to 1955. With direction from Hal Prince and music by Stephen Sondheim, Merrily stood out as one of the most anticipated shows of the 1981 season, a sentiment quickly abandoned once the show actually opened.
And a shocking night on Broadway. Merrily We Roll Along, in large part the work of masters of the musical theater, Stephen Sondheim and Hal Prince, is neither merry nor does it roll along. In fact, it clunks, lurches, and on several occasions faints dead away.
Merrily got ravaged by the critics, and confused audience members often walked out mid-performance. The musical lasted on Broadway for a total of 16 performances. 41 years later, the name of Merrily's theater may have changed, but the fascination over the show's short Broadway run remains the same.
Do you want to hold the camera?
No.
So tell me everything I need to know about Merrily.
This is Howard Ho, a music theory expert and composer who knows a thing or two about Sondheim.
It was the last of that era of Sondheim. It was like the last Hal Prince Sondheim show. I mean, they had a great run where it was like Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, Pacific Overtures, Sweeney Todd, Merrily, right? Like that's unparalleled, you know, just amazing envelope pushing stuff.
It's easy to look at Sondheim now as the gold standard of musical theater. Recent successful revivals of Company, Into the Woods, and Assassins make it easy to forget that actually a lot of Sondheim's shows flopped in their first run on Broadway. Many failed to recoup during their initial runs and often received a pretty lackluster commercial response, especially compared to the mega musical spectacles of Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Like they're almost like these twin sides of musical theater. Andrew Lloyd Webber is like pop, you know, he's just kind of like this person who does like these big musical gestures where it's like Jesus Christ Superstar, you know, Phantom. And Sondheim's much more subtle and much more about like, you know, musical theater specific sound, American musical theater sound. I think Merrily is a great example of that because Sondheim specifically was like, I'm gonna write this in like 32 bar song form, which was the like Broadway standard of like the 50s, and he knew that the audiences wouldn't like it as much. But he's like, no.
He still wrote it.
he still wrote it, and he's like, we're going back in time, so they'll appreciate it because, you know, as we go back in time, it'll make more sense. It wants you to like lean in a little bit more than you would at like a spectacular kind of show.
The juxtaposition between Sondheim and Lloyd Webber is what made the 1980s Broadway landscape such an interesting one. Two composers in their prime embodying opposite ends of the spectrum. Lloyd Webber pumped out these massive, spectacle-driven behemoths that critics despised, but audiences loved. Meanwhile, Sondheim wrote reserved, scaled-down, and detail-oriented pieces that audiences overlooked, but critics revered. Of course, that reverence didn't really apply to Merrily. The musical premiered on Broadway in rough shape. It got butchered by the New York Times, received no Tony Awards, and failed to recoup after its closure. The mother of all flops. Does that make Stephen Sondheim any less of a great artist? Of course not. Just like it doesn't make Merrily an outright artistic failure. It was a victim of circumstance. Something Sondheim does better than anyone else is showcase the trivial nature of the flop. Theater as a medium constantly evolves. Shows are never finished, they just change. As Sondheim once said in an interview with 60 Minutes,
because what keeps the theater alive is reinterpretation. What's great about the theater is it's a living organism, whereas movies and television are as if in amber. It's not that they're dead, but they're only alive in one shape, form, and tone.
This is what led Merrily We Roll Along to eventually find a second life, thanks to a cast album and decades of rewrites. In a testament to how far the once infamous Broadway flop has come, the 2022 revival at the New York Theater Workshop sold out in just 10 minutes. Despite its global reputation as the end-all be-all for musical theater, Broadway only spans 14 blocks and 41 theaters, predominantly controlled by just 3 separate theater owners. The scarcity means supply always outweighs demand, leaving a never-ending trail of suitors constantly waiting for shows to close in order for them to move in. Sometimes, the pressure of Broadway profitability takes its toll on creativity and leads to a half-baked production. But what actually happens after a show flops on Broadway? After the lights dim, the snarky headlines vanish, and the story becomes lore. Where does it go?
How academic do you want me getting? Because there's whole books about it.
You can get as academic as you want.
Hi, I'm Margaret Hall. I'm a musical theater historian. I'm a part of Team Playbill, and I am probably the biggest fan of vampire musicals you'll ever meet. I love Broadway as much as anybody. I have literally dedicated my life to it, but it is not the same thing as an art form. Broadway's a place. Broadway is an industry. It is not the theater. It is not the musical theater. That's something that's been marketing spun to us, that Broadway is the best of the art form. That's a press push. That's not reality. The flop moniker's complicated because it means something different to everybody, particularly different from generation to generation. Because a lot of my favorite musicals are flops, and a lot of people's favorite musicals are flops. That's why there's entire situations like If It Only Runs a Minute. And to me, that means they're succeeding on some level. There's something that's resonating, and certainly with something like The Addams Family.
Snap up your tickets today.
Last night was the first preview, and it was, and then we had.
The only thing scarier than The Addams Family on Broadway were the reviews. Article after article criticized everything from the music to the script to the presentation as a whole. The musical's shortcomings first became evident after a less than stellar critical response in Chicago a year prior. Off the back of this review, the producers realized that the current directors couldn't deliver the showman flair needed for the Broadway transfer, and replaced them right before tickets went on sale for the Broadway run. This left the creative team face to face with a nearly impossible task, completely retooling 3 years worth of work with a new director and a new vision, all in a little less than 3 months. Try as they did, the structural problems that plagued the Addams Family musical proved far too complex to solve in such a limited amount of time. The backstage gossip from the directorial switch-up and the negative press didn't help matters. By the time the show opened on Broadway, a majority of critics already made up their minds, including the New York Times. However, thanks to name recognition and some big Broadway stars helping fuel advanced ticket sales, the Addams Family ran a little over a year. But it still failed to win any Tony Awards or recoup its full $16 million capitalization, and was haunted by bad reviews. The Addams Family flopped. But shortly after, something interesting happened. Instead of taking the L and leaving the musical in the past, the entire creative team went back to work. Out of the public eye and no longer facing the immense pressure of an impending Broadway opening, the creative team finally found the freedom to sit down and completely rip the show apart, using the insight gained from past runs to rewrite huge chunks of the material. The Addams Family remarkably rebounded from Broadway flop to national treasure, consistently landing on the list of most stage shows in America.
That show has probably made more money in its lifetime now in a life off Broadway than a lot of hit Broadway shows, because it continues to resonate just in a different market.
Just because a musical doesn't play well to this very specific demographic of New York tourists, that doesn't mean it's signed its own death warrant. Think about some popular musicals performed by schools, community theater troupes, or even regionally. Legally Blonde, The Little Mermaid, Seussical, all Broadway flops, all found commercial success only after they left the scrutinizing noise of the Great White Way. As Margaret said, Broadway's portrayal as the end-all be-all of musical theater only happened a few decades ago.
Dream come true. Good evening, I'm Roger Grimsby. Here now the news. Another piece of New York fell by the curbside today for who knows how long.
I'm out here in the dark. I can't find my way.
In 1974, the theater district consisted of 38 theaters. 15 of them sat empty. Nobody dared go near that part of town. The now sanitized and commercial metropolis bears no resemblance to the seedy shambles of the past.
Every day in New York State, 6 people are murdered, and 5 of those, count them, 5, are murdered right here in New York City.
It's an uptight situation we're in, it seems, with the economy and things the way it's going.
The state has done all it can. The city has done and is committed to do in the months ahead more of what we've done.
The first answer from the Ford administration was a loud, firm no.
This just looked too good to me. And I'll be hustling on 42nd Street in the snow if I stay in New York.
But then the 80s rolled around, and everything changed.
Our aim is to increase our national wealth so all will have more.
And everybody's on roller skates, and everybody is a railway train, and everybody goes at least 40 miles an hour for most of the production.
You know, it used to be that in this country, we were the originators of the musical. Now they're coming from London. Cats and Me and My Girl. And
Cameron McIntosh says a couple of the reasons are, number one, that it's much less expensive to produce a show in London now, and number two, the critics aren't as powerful there.
And here you can get killed in one night, yeah.
The next decade saw Broadway flooded with multi-million-dollar spectacles that placed showmanship before story. and New York audiences ate it up. In 1980, the Broadway industry brought in $197 million. In 1989, it brought in $282 million. In the fight between American musical theater and the British mega musical, the mega musical won.
The entertainment event of the year.
People started to notice the financial potential the industry held. And with each new box office smash, Broadway transcended from a street to this symbol of perceived excellence. But 40 years removed from the mega musical takeover, what happens when a show considered a flop by Broadway standards follows the mega musical formula in reverse, scaling down in size and only finding success once they transfer to the West End?
There we go. Hold on, whatever I'm doing is not working, if you can hear me.
Since I'm based in New York City, my perspective of the UK theater scene is limited to the And Juliet cast album and Back to the Future YouTube clips. So to get a better perspective, I reached out to Mickey Joe, a theater vlogger and critic based just outside of London.
I've never heard UK theatre pundits using the word flop or talking about flops. It's just not something that we think of over here because UK shows don't publish their grosses. So we have no concept of a show's financial success. So they don't announce if they have recouped the initial investment or not. So just the financial version of a flop, it's really hard to say, and we don't know.
You know, usually the case is that shows, they go from the UK to Broadway, but it seems like there's been this trend lately where it's like they go to Broadway, then they get even better in the UK.
There definitely have been things, I think it's on a case-by-case basis, but something like Amelie that had such a different life here in the UK and such a different production here in the UK.
Amelie the musical opened on Broadway in April of 2017, and it closed 1 month later. A musical adaptation of the 2001 film Amelie, the show tells the story of a woman with a big imagination who uses meddling as a form of connecting with other people. Originally one of Broadway's most anticipated shows of the 2017 season, ticket sales dried up quick thanks to an underwhelming New York Times review and no Tony nominations. Unlike the artistry and minimal avant-garde nature of its source material, the New York production turned up the volume to make Amelie a brassy and bloated Broadway spectacle. Amelie joins Merrily in the mother of all flops territory, seeing as how it also ran under a year and completely lost its $12 million investment. But 2 years later, a completely retooled Amelie opened in the United Kingdom. Unlike the traditional path forged by 1980s mega musicals a la Andrew Lloyd Webber, Amelie reinvented itself by stripping away the spectacle and narrowing back in on the story. The show became an overnight hit, scoring mostly positive reviews and 3 Olivier nominations, the UK version of the Tonys.
I think it speaks to the difference in style between Broadway and the West End, because discernibly the same shows can be successful on both. A lot of the things that come over from Broadway are these huge, lavish musical theatre productions, and a lot of the things that we send over that have the most success that come from the UK to New York are like really introspective plays, and it's sort of a different style. So it's interesting for a show like Amelie, where those two productions were both quite characteristic of those two different styles, for it to have had so much more success here in the UK.
So, what is a Broadway flop? Is it a measure of artistry? Is it a reflection of a show's quality? Is it the figurative black spot that sends a musical to the morgue? Considering how some of the greatest musicals in Broadway history technically count as commercial flops, maybe it's easier to define what a Broadway flop isn't. A flop isn't a series of snarky headlines. It's not a death sentence. It's not a definitive judgment of a musical's quality, nor a measure of the talent involved. Everyone is quick to celebrate Babe Ruth's 714 home runs, but forget that he also struck out 488 times. Einstein figured out E equals MC squared, but incorrectly thought that the universe wasn't expanding. Taylor Swift broke a Spotify record for the most streamed album in a day, but also wrote Beautiful Ghosts. Does that make Babe Ruth a horrible baseball player? Einstein an idiot? Taylor Swift anything less than a musical goddess? Of course not. It makes them human, and does not make them any less worthy of appreciation. With that reasoning, it doesn't make any sense to assume that the word flop means the same thing as the word bad, because they're more than that. Just because a musical wasn't a multi-million-dollar smash, didn't run on Broadway for 20 years, or receive countless awards, that doesn't mean it is any less worthy of respect and recognition. Flops are lessons. A fascinating psychological study of how a series of ideas can somehow fail to line up. Lessons in the dangers of pride, the ridiculousness of exuberance, the humor of misunderstanding, and the heartbreak of greed. And that is why it is so important that we keep talking about them. Calling a Broadway flop should be no different than calling an orange. It's what they are. If anything, flops are the shows that you should actively seek out, because the chances are higher that those musicals are more daring, more moving, and above all else, more entertaining than a lot of the hits. They shouldn't be ignored. They should be celebrated. So keeping that in mind, click on this video to start your journey into the world of flops with the history of my favorite flop, American Psycho, the musical.